Good evening to everyone in this room and online, and welcome once again to the lecture series Control, Coercion and Constraint. Tonight we will have the pleasure to hear a talk by Professor Wolfram Kinzig on religious dependency in the early church. I happen to know Wolfram fairly well because, among other things, he supervised my doctoral thesis. Therefore, I've been granted the pleasure to introduce him very briefly to those of you who don't know him quite that well. Wolfram Kinzig has been a professor for church history at the Faculty of Protestant Theology here in Bonn since 1996. His research and his teaching focuses on the early church and the long 19th century. Wolfram's research interests include the development and history of ancient creeds, Jewish-Christian relations, and the history of science, also known in German as Wissenschaftsgeschichte. It would be madness to try and list even a sample of his publications here. But let me just draw your attention to two more recent ones. His opus magnum is a commented collection of early Christian creeds and creed-related texts called Faith in Formulae in 4 volumes. He has also just written a book on the persecutions of Christians in the Roman Empire, which provides a unique perspective on these gruesome events by way of analyzing the acts of the martyrs. More recently, Wolfram has started to look into dependency structures in the late antique and early medieval Western Church, and I believe his talk today will present some of the results of his latest research. So without further ado, let us welcome Wolfram Kinzig and find out how to actually abjure Satan, his pomp and his service.
Thank you, Julia Winnebeck, for this very kind introduction. And without further ado, myself, I will start with my talk today, and I'm quite happy to welcome questions after the talk. Also from the internet, you can type in questions on the chat, and they will be then, I will then be asked those questions here. I will start with a piece of ecclesial gossip. In a letter which he wrote in 428 or 429, Augustine, bishop of the north of African port Hippo Regius, told his friend Alypius, bishop of Thagaste, some 60 miles south of Hippo, a piece of ecclesial gossip. The protagonist of this story, which Augustine had only heard secondhand, was a certain Dioscorus, the chief physician, archiater, of an unknown location. Here you can see a picture from the 6th century, how we should imagine those physicians. Dioscorus must have enjoyed a considerable reputation as a doctor because Augustine did not feel it necessary to provide further information about this person. Dioscorus was a kind man, but a fierce critic of Christianity. Thus it came as a great surprise that Dioscorus, when his daughter fell seriously ill, prayed to Christ and vowed to become a Christian should she be saved. His prayers were answered and his daughter recovered. Yet the good doctor reneged on his vow. As a result, he was affected by a temporary loss of sight, which he interpreted as a divine punishment for the breach of his promise. Here is the central sequence of the story in Augustine's own words. He cried out and confessed and vowed again that he would fulfill what he had vowed if light be returned to him. It returned. He fulfilled his vow, and still the hand of the Lord was raised. He had not committed the creed to memory, or perhaps had refused to commit it and made the excuse that he was unable. God saw. Immediately after all the ceremonies of his reception, he was undone by a paralysis in many, indeed almost all his members. Then, being warned by a dream, he confessed in writing that he had been told that this had happened because he had not recited the creed. After that confession, The use of all his members was restored to him, excepting only the tongue. Nevertheless, he, being still under the same affliction, disclosed in writing that he had nonetheless learned the creed and still retained it in his memory. And so that frivolity, which, as you know, blemished his natural kindness and made him exceedingly profane when he mocked Christians, was altogether destroyed in him. Unfortunately, we are not told what exactly had happened before Dioscorus turned to praying to Christ. No doubt the famous physician must have tried several cures, which may have involved certain pagan rituals, but which in the end remained unsuccessful. He may then have resorted to praying, perhaps first to some local deity, again to no avail. At this point, he may have realized that his gods were ultimately less potent than he had assumed, and in his distress he turned to the God of the Christians and took a vow, or in more modern words, he struck a deal. He promised to become a Christian and in return expected his daughter to be cured by divine intervention. Dioscorus' behavior was by no means eccentric. He continued to move within the parameters of Roman religion, which were based on the principle do ut des. I promise the gods veneration if they do something in return for me. This appeared to bring the long-expected success. His daughter recovered. But Dioscorus tried to cheat on God. Although he had taken a vow and was therefore committed to honoring the obligations he had made, he tried to withdraw, with terrible results. He was struck twice by illness. After first turning blind, Dioscorus decided to register for the catechumenate. But in the end, he hesitated to go through with the preparatory rites for baptism. Part of the catechumenate was the traditio and reditio symboli. At some point before the date of baptism, usually Easter, the bishop handed over, that is, explained the creed, symbolum, to the candidates for baptism and asked them to memorize it. Some days later, they had solemnly to give it back, that is, recite it in the presence of the bishop. Here, at the reditio, Dioscorus had managed to withdraw from the recitation of the creed. He may have pretended some illness or shyness or bad memory. In any case, he had obviously been excused. We do not know why Dioscorus did this. It may have been the stubbornness of an elderly man, but it may also have been fear of what would happen to him if he gave up the traditional worship which his forefathers had practiced for centuries and which, in his view, had guaranteed his professional success. But then something happened which made him change his mind once again. His daughter's cure may have been the catalyst in this process of conversion, but ultimately it was a series of illnesses that struck Dioscorus which accelerated it. After having suffered a stroke, Dioscorus, as the result of a dream, understood that his fate was no longer determined by the traditional gods, but that the Christian God had taken over and a new system of religious dependency had been established. In the end, being unable to speak, he performed the reditio in writing. Second section, preparation to baptism in the early church. And you can see here what I'm going to explain now. But this is, of course, a much later picture, but I think it symbolizes it very well. Whatever the details of this story, and I will come back to some aspects of it later, it makes clear that the ancient Mediterranean world was a system of dependencies which transcended the empirical realm. The social order which structured society and in which the majority of people existed as members of the lower classes or even as slaves in a situation of utter dependency on the goodwill of their masters or owners was embedded in a larger hierarchy which also included the realm which existed beyond what could be perceived with our bodily senses and which could only be accessed by those endowed with a philosophical intellect, if at all. This metaphysical realm included the gods and all other spiritual beings, such as the angels and the devil and demons. And the visible world was generally considered subordinate to the will and actions of these supernatural beings. In early Christianity, it was thought that humans were able, by a system of rites with legal implications, to extract themselves from the power of the devil and of the traditional gods, who were considered to be evil demons, and to place themselves under the sole power of Christ. It is this change of allegiance and dependency which I want to explain to you in this lecture. Ultimately, this conversion was of course sealed by baptism itself, but the submersion of the convert in water was only the end of a longer process called the catechumenate. I do not want to explain the system of the catechumenate here, as its details are quite complicated. Instead, I will briefly sketch its fundamental structure and then deal with two aspects in some more detail. By the end of the 2nd century, Christian initiation was basically a 3-stage process. The first stage was called conversion, turning about. The technical term epistrophe, conversio, already indicates that it implied a fundamental change with regard to the convert's life, the turning away from his or her old life, and the adoption of a new moral code. Converts to Christianity were expected to control their sexual life, to display a certain self-control as regards food and drink, to promote social cohesion and social justice through almsgiving, and finally, to avoid all acts and rites associated with their former gods and beliefs. Once the convert sought to enter the Christian community, he became a catechumen and was taught for a certain period of time about the central Christian beliefs and tenets. Finally, he or she was baptized. And you can see here a very nice image of a baptistry, the baptistry in the Basilica of St. John in Ephesus. And you can see they walked down into the water. There was water in this piscina, as we call it. And they walked down there, and then, she was submerged. And there are no images of baptisms in the early church, except this one, for example, which is a special one. Can we dim the lights some a little? This looks good. Yeah. Kann man das auch noch? Yeah, that's good. Okay, because it's if we don't dim the light, you can't see how nice this mosaic, this famous mosaic from Ravenna really is. And there you can see Christ being baptized. But that's of course not typical, right? It's a special baptism, and it's complicated also because we don't really know who the person on the left is who's sitting there, whether this is some kind of river god or whatever. Which perhaps wouldn't fit. In order to be admitted to baptism, the catechumens had to undergo an examination, and if successful, were repeatedly exorcised so that they would be cleansed from all evil spirits. The clergy had to make absolutely sure that no demons remained in the baptizants and that they were pure enough to receive baptism. These exorcisms were accompanied by the two rites of apotaxis or apotagē and syntaxis, syntagē, renunciation and engagement. And, second rite, traditio and reditio symboli, the handing over and recitation of the creed. It is these two rites which I wish to focus on in the next minutes, because they symbolize or even enact the change of religious allegiance referred to in the title of my paper. So first, the rite of apotaxis and syntaxis. In order to explain what this rite was about, I turned to one of the most influential theologians of the 5th century, Theodore, Bishop of Mopsuestia in Cilicia, Kilikien in German. A series of catechetical homilies has come down to us in Syriac translation, in which Theodore explains the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, baptism, and the Eucharist. In what follows, I will focus on the rites preceding baptism. In Theodore's description, probably delivered sometime at the end of the 4th century, and this description or this interpretation is also found in many other Christian authors of the period. In this description, the world is dominated by two competing systems of dependency. One headed by Christ, who is ultimately victorious, the other by the devil. Satan had laid a claim on humankind ever since the fall of Adam. In his sermon, Theodore stages a veritable courtroom drama. Satan's ownership of humankind had been challenged by his slaves. He takes his case to the divine court, as a result of which humankind defends itself against its devilish accuser as follows. But it is necessary that a judgment should be given for us against the tyrant who is fighting the case against us, that is to say, Satan, who is always envious of our deliverance and salvation. He shows here also the same ill will towards us and tries and endeavors to file suit against us as if we had no right to be outside his ownership. He pleads that from ancient times and from our being in legal succession to the head of our race, we belong to him by right. Theodore then gives the floor to the accuser, who recapitulates the story of the fall of Adam and God's pronouncement against Adam in Genesis 3:18-19, which entitled Satan to ownership of Adam and of all his descendants. Satan concludes, "From the fact that by his own will he, Adam, chose my lordship, you clearly belong to me, as I am the prince of the powers of the air and of the spirit. But now I work in the children of disobedience. How then is it possible that this man, who from the beginning and from the time of his forefathers belongs to me, as a just death sentence was passed against him in this mortal world, and where he still is and where I hold sway over him, should be taken away from this world and from this way of life, and consequently from my lordship also, which he himself chose willingly? And should he now become immortal, a thing which is higher than his nature? And should he be seen in the life and occupations of the abode of heaven? This does not pertain to humans or to beings who have this human nature, who are different from those who are endowed with a higher nature." Humankind, therefore, is forced to show and establish the title it possesses. That originally we did not belong to Satan and to our forefathers, but to God who created us while we were not and made us in his own image, and that it was through the iniquity and the wickedness of the tyrant and through our own negligence that we were driven towards evil. Therefore we lost also the honor and greatness of the divine image, and because of our malice we further received the punishment of death. Finally, it was Christ who through his death abolished human sin and transgression and thus came to humankind's rescue. In the end, after having listened to both sides, God passes a sentence. He condemned the tyrant for the ill will of which he had made use against him, Christ, or God, and against all our race, and pronounced judgment against him. Therefore he raised Christ our Lord from the dead, and made him immortal and immutable, and took him to heaven. And he vouchsafed to all the human race the joy of his gift, so that no room might be left to the slanderer from which to inflict injuries on us. The moment when this transition from the tyranny of the devil to the merciful reign of Christ could be made by the individual believer was the rite of apotaxis, renunciation, and syntaxis, engagement. Here the candidates for baptism were actually declaring their change of ownership from Satan to Christ. The words of this rite varied in the Greek church, but its basic formula looked like this. I abjure you, apotasomai, Satan, and all your pomp and your worship service, and I engage myself, syntasomai, Christ, to you. The verb apotasomai is often translated into English as I renounce, and understood as an expression of abstention or even of asceticism. But other semantic nuances were also attached to this term and therefore to the rite of that name. In papyri, apotasomai is used in a legal context, designating withdrawal from legal obligations resulting from a contract. In addition, in contracts and other documents, the term was also used as a part of a formula indicating renunciation of legal support. Finally, apotasomai and syntasomai could be understood as withdrawing from and placing oneself under someone's command, and leaving and joining troops or a commander's entourage, taxis. Hence, the terminology used here could also evoke juridical and military associations. The idea of a change of allegiance and its legal consequences may also be indicated in the use of the much discussed term pompa. In the explanation of the Church Fathers from Tertullian onwards, the pompa diaboli, the devil's pomp, is simply everything sinful associated with the devil, in particular the theatre and the circus, pagan cults and their festivals, inappropriate songs and music, and other licentious or cult-related behavior. However, pompa originally designates a procession associated with some cult or an escort, such as that following the emperor or some other important magistrate, and other parades. And you can see here such a parade from a famous mosaic from Sousse in Tunisia, the triumph of Bacchus. The candidates for baptism may always have associated this nuance with their act of abjuration. Leaving Satan meant also leaving his retinue and joining the cohorts of Christ, who was superior to the Prince of Darkness. The recitation of the formula by the candidates was accompanied by a series of outward gestures and signs. Theodore describes them like this. The candidates stood barefooted on some sackcloth and took off their outer garments, such that they ended up standing there in their underwear. Then they stretched out their hands towards God and looked towards heaven as if to pray. So like an orans, which we have here, a person praying, as we know it from the catacombs. That's, but she or he, it's not quite clear, is wearing his or her outer garments. Finally, they genuflected while keeping the rest of their body erect and said the formula of apotaxis and syntaxis. In Theodore's congregation, in a slightly extended version. I abjure Satan and all his angels and all his works and all his service and all his earthly deception. And I engage myself and believe and am baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Then the priest, clad in shining robes, signed the candidates on their forehead with chrism, so a special kind of salve, and said, "So and so is sealed in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." Finally, the godfathers spread an orarium, a linen stole, on the crown of their heads, raised them and made them stand up erect, the baptizers. For each element of this rite, Theodore offers an extensive explanation. In this context is his comment on the words of apotaxis and syntaxis matters most. This is the reason why you say, "I abjure Satan." Formerly, even if you wished it, you did not dare to make use of these words, because you were afraid of his servitude. But as you have, by a divine decree, received freedom from him, the devil, through the exorcisms, you proclaim and abjure him with confidence and by your own words. And this is the reason why you say, "I abjure Satan." Through the apotaxis, the converts renounced their association with Satan and withdrew from that, as Theodore says, cruel and ancient contract which resulted in the calamitous servitude to him under which they lived. They were able to do this because Christ had freed them from the yoke of the tyrant, had delivered them from his servitude, and had granted them a share in his merciful gifts. And there's a wonderful miniature in a manuscript from the Carolingian times, which is probably a copy of an older manuscript, and you can see here how Christ says goodbye to the devil, right? So that's this kind of imagery they were perhaps also associating. This may look like some kind of freedom discourse, and indeed, in many baptismal homilies, following the example of the New Testament, the liberation from the devil and from sin is described as a liberation from slavery. However, this does not imply that the newly baptized Christians were seen in any way as enjoying from now on some kind of legal, social, or moral autonomy. In all ancient Christian writers, freedom from the devil meant service to Christ, which consisted in adopting the moral conduct prescribed by the new master and laid down in the New Testament. Theodore concludes the section on the apotaxis and syntaxis by saying, "As when you say, 'I abjure Satan' and keep entirely away from him, you indicate never to revert to him, nor to wish to associate yourself with him anymore, so also when you say, 'I engage myself,' you show that you will remain steadfastly with God, that you will henceforth be unshakably with him, that you will never separate yourself in any way from him, and you will consider it most precious to be and to live with him and to lead a life that is in harmony with his laws." Both relationships, the old one with Satan and the new one with Christ, are regulated by contracts obliging one partner to serve the other. Through the apotaxis, one of these contracts is dissolved, and through the syntaxis, a new one is established. These contracts are thus not concluded between equal partners, but they are, as it were, contracts regulating an asymmetrical dependency in the strongest sense of the term. However, the new contract no longer leads to the perishment of humankind as a result of Adam's and its own sins, but ultimately to its liberation from sin. John Chrysostom, the most famous preacher of the ancient Greek church, Patriarch of Constantinople 398 to 404 or 407, expressed this change of dependency even more forcefully in one of his baptismal homilies. "And I ask you who are about to be initiated to learn these words of renunciation. They constitute a contract, syntheke, with the master. When we are buying slaves, we first ask those who are for sale if they are willing to serve us. Christ does the same. When he is about to take you into his service, he first asks you if you are willing to put away that cruel and harsh tyrant, and he accepts from you your contracts, synthekas. He does not force his mastership on you. And consider God's loving kindness, philanthropia. Before we pay out the price, we question the slaves who are for sale, and only when we learn that they are willing to serve us, do we pay out the price. But Christ does not deal in this way. He paid the price for all of us, his precious blood. You have been bought with a price, says Paul. And even so, he does not force those to serve him who are unwilling to do so. Unless you are grateful, he says, and are willing of yourself and of your own accord to be enrolled under me as your master, I do not force or compel you. We ourselves would never choose to buy wicked slaves, and even if we ever should so choose, we buy and pay the price because of a bad choice. But when Christ buys reckless and lawless slaves, he pays the price of the first-class slave. Rather, he pays a much greater price, so much greater that neither mind nor reason can grasp its greatness. For he has bought us, not by giving the heavens, the earth, and the sea, but what is more valuable than all of these, by paying down his own blood. And after all this, he does not demand witnesses of us, nor written documents, engrapha, but he is satisfied with our bare statement. If you say from the heart, I abjure you, Satan, and your pomp, he has received all that he asks. The new master does not, in fact, act like we would expect him to do. In economic terms, his behavior is foolish, since he pays the highest price for his new slaves, whom he doesn't know. In his buying behavior, Christ no longer conforms to the practices of slaves markets in the Roman Empire. Servitude to Christ is described by Chrysostom as transcending the traditional structures of asymmetrical dependency, because Christ acts out of loving kindness for his slaves, thus, in fact, subverting these structures. Fourth section, the creed is contract. The second rite, which was closely connected to the change of religious allegiance through conversion to Christianity, was the handing over and recitation of the creed, the traditio, reditio, symboli. As I mentioned before, a central part of the catechumenate was instruction in the basics of Christianity. This comprised an introduction into worship and the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist, and an exposition of the Lord's Prayer, which was seen as the archetypal prayer, and of the fundamental tenets of doctrine as contained in the creed. And here you can see there's another famous miniature from the so-called Utrecht Psalter, because it's kept in Utrecht. And you can see here the beginning of the Apostles' Creed, or rather a version which is very close to the Apostles' Creed, and a very odd kind of illustration of the contents of the Apostles' Creed, which is parts of which are difficult to decipher, but it's one of the few examples of illustrations of the creed. The creed was primarily understood as a summary of the Christian faith which the candidates had to memorize. Its purpose was not only didactic, it also served as a token of membership. The worshippers recited it at the beginning of the Eucharistic service as proof that they were full-fledged members of the Christian congregation and were permitted to take part in Mass. However, in the explanations of the Creed, especially by Latin authors, we also find another function of the Creed. From the late 4th century onward, these explanations abound with legal terminology. The creed is often described as a contract or treatise, much like the syntaxis in the case of Theodore of Mopsuestia. This interpretation rested upon the etymology of the word symbolum, which is the technical term for designating the creed. Symbolum was originally a Greek word, but strangely enough, it was not used by the Greek fathers as a designation for the creed until much later. Symbolon originally had a great variety of meanings. Here we are only interested in those that concern the legal sphere. Symbolon designated a tally or token serving as proof of identity and also as guarantee, warrant, official document, contract, or receipt in various contexts. The lexeme can also be used as a term for treaty or contract. In their explanations of the creed, the Latin fathers always feel obliged at some point to explain the meaning of symbolum, because the term was largely unknown in Latin outside catechesis. Many fathers translate symbolum as contract or pact. This is then usually followed by a religious interpretation. Most often it is said that symbolum is the contract the baptizants made with the Lord, witnessed by angels and humans. The fathers describe this particular contract in a variety of terms. For example, Peter Chrysologus, Bishop of Ravenna, 424 to 451, calls it repeatedly a contract of faith, a contract of life, a contract of hope, a pledge of life, a pledge of salvation, a pledge of grace, a pledge of faith, a guarantee of faith. And it is an insoluble bond of faith between the believer and God, which has been bestowed for the salvation of the person who professes it. Fides in these contexts means faith, but it also means reliability in contracts made between business partners. Therefore, in the explanations of the creed, the spheres of business and of religion overlap to a large degree, and it is difficult to say whether or not this kind of terminology is used in a metaphorical sense, or whether the preachers thought that an actual contractual engagement would take place in baptism. I'm very puzzled about this, whether they actually thought that a contract was being made. A good example for this kind of baptismal discourse is found in a sermon by Peter Chrysologus, who admonishes the candidates for baptism as follows. We are taught that even in a human pact, a pledge or a contract, which contains hopes for immediate or future gain, is called symbol. Nevertheless, duplicate documents always confirm that agreement between the two parties, and human wariness is appropriate with respect to a debt obligation, lest treachery, always the enemy of pacts, might creep in and deceive. But this is the case between human beings, among whom fraud damages either the one by whom it is done or the other to whom it is done. But between God and human beings, the agreement of faith is confirmed by faith alone. It is entrusted not to the letter, but to the spirit. It is entrusted and committed to the heart, not to a sheet of paper, since divine credit has no need of any human pledge. God does not know how to commit fraud and is incapable of suffering it, since he is not hindered by time, nor restrained by age, nor deceived by concealment. He sees what is hidden, he retains what is stolen, and he possesses what is refused him. For God's account is always solvent, since there is nowhere for what he has entrusted to another to be lost. The following is the case for the human being, not for God. What is lost to the one who rejects is not lost for the one who lends it. But you say, why does someone who cannot be deceived demand a pledge? Why does he want an agreement? He wants it for your sake, not for his, not because he has any doubts, but so that you might believe. He wants an agreement, since the one who entered into your death does not disdain entering into a pact with you, Satan. He wants an agreement because although he's always lending everything, he wants to be in debt himself. He wants an agreement because now he's calling you not to a present reality, but to faith. Through the present pledge, he also entices and invites you to future gain. God's behavior is then once more eccentric in economic terms. He demands no written agreement and grants us all the profit. Explanations such as these were part of the traditio symboli, the ceremony disclosing the content of the creed by the bishop. As I indicated before, it was then to be learned by heart and shortly before the actual baptismal service to be recited in front of the congregation. The liturgical framing of the creed and the solemn setting of the traditio and reditio symboli, which was accompanied by the insistent admonitions of the preachers not to write it down lest it fell into the hand of non-believers, led to the sacralization of this particular text. I cannot go into this here any further. Suffice it to say that regardless of the bishop's warnings, creeds were written down and were then used as charms, or were recited to protect from the danger of journeys, or to enhance the efficacy of medicinal herbs. The combination of apotaxis and the creed. Occasionally, the reditio appears to have been replaced the syntaxis in the Eastern Church. This seems, for example, to have been the case in Jerusalem. We have a description of the rites in a series of mystagogical catecheses, baptismal homilies, which may perhaps be ascribed to Cyril of Jerusalem, second half of the 4th century, and may have been preached in the 380s. Here the candidates entered the antechamber of the baptistry, faced towards the west, stretched out their hands and said, "I renounce you, Satan, and all your works, and all your pomp, and all your service." The preacher explained that the west was the region of darkness, the realm of the prince of night. This act entailed the annulment of the covenant, diatheke or syntheke, humankind had concluded with Satan after the fall. This continues, "When you renounce Satan, trampling underfoot every covenant with him, then you annul that ancient league with hell, and God's paradise opens before you, that Eden planted in the east, from which for his discretion our first father was banished. Symbolic of this is your facing about from the west to the east, the place of light. It was at this point that you were told to say, I believe in the Father, and in the Son, and in the Holy Spirit, and in one baptism of repentance." It looks as if here the creed replaced the simple formula, "I engage myself, Christ, to you." The candidates were then led into the baptistry itself, where they were asked one by one whether they believed in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and were immersed in the water. Thus the creed appears to have been doubled, once in declaratory form in lieu of the syntaxis, and once in interrogatory form at the baptism proper. By and large, however, the number of occurrences where the brief formula of syntaxis was replaced by the much more elaborate creed or by creedal questions in the Eastern Church is limited. There are also some cases where both formula of syntaxis and the creed or some creedal formula were recited. In the Latin West, however, we find no equivalent to the Greek formula of syntaxis at all. It appears never to have been used. Instead, here the creed or creedal questions followed upon the renunciation. Sometimes the reditio symboli and the reply to the renunciation with either the entire creed or some briefer formula were two separate rites. In other places, the reditio and the syntaxis may in fact have coincided. As a result of this process, the two separate legal discourses about the meaning of baptism, that of the apotaxis and that of the creed as symbolum were also amalgamated. The combination of apodoxis and creedal questions persisted in the Roman Church over the centuries and is still found in the present Roman Missal. In its rite of baptism, it contains the following dialogue. Celebrant, do you renounce Satan? Parents, godparents, it's infant baptism, I do. Celebrant and all his works, parents and godparents, I do. Celebrant and all his empty show, parents and godparents, I do. This is followed by the creedal questions. Interestingly still, they don't say he or she does, they say I do, so they take the place of the infant, right? But it's still acted out like an adult baptism. Finally, some summary remarks. Oh, let me just go back to this and look at the person in the bottom right. Can you see that? The skin color. Can you see the skin color of the person who's being baptized here? It's interesting. It's a black person. So this miniature is inclusive, right? Tries to include everyone. I find that very interesting. I don't think it has ever been commented upon. So some summary remarks. First, baptism in the early church was a change of religious allegiance. This involved the replacement of one system of asymmetrical dependency that depending on the traditional gods with another, that of Christ. 2. In the Greek church, the change of allegiance was ritually prepared by exorcisms performed through the rite of abjuration to Satan and his dominion and pledge to Christ, and sealed by baptism itself. In the Latin Church, the pledge to Christ consisted not in a separate formula of pledge, but in the recitation of the creed or in answering questions relating to the creed. 3. In order to explain this change in baptism, the preachers in the late antique church used two overlapping discourses of dependency. One was attached to the Greek rite of apodoxis and syntaxis, the other was attached to the creed. 4. The old relationship between Satan and his followers, often identified with the old gods, which were now seen as demons, and Christ and the believers, was described as one of patronage, of slavery, or of military, and for its description often terms of contractual law were used. 5. The new relationship with Christ, which was established through baptism, was by no means symmetrical either, but required total obedience and trust by the believers, which was to be expressed in a certain moral behavior and in one's faith in the salvific action of Christ as formulated in the creed. However, the relationship between master and slave was marked by the master's unconditional love for his servants. This background then may help to explain the enormous significance which Dioscorus, the protagonist of our initial story, attached to this transition, why initially he was hesitant to make it, and why eventually he interpreted his paralysis as a punishment for not having recited the creed. He had ignored that his divine owner had changed, and as a result had suffered divine retribution. On the surface, the religious systems of dependency that I have described had no immediate bearing on the social systems of dependency. Free persons remained free and slaves remained slaves. But the central commandment in the new moral code, the commandment to love one's neighbor, also included slaves. And slaves, just like all other marginalized and oppressed people, were welcome in the church as full-fledged members and were invited to share its promises of salvation. John Chrysostom expressed this new state in his inimitable style. Did you see the abundance of his goodness? Did you see the munificence of his invitation? Come to me, he says, all you who labor and are burdened. His invitation is one of kindness. His goodness is beyond description. Come to me all, not only rulers, but also their subjects, not only the rich, but also the poor, not only the free, but also the slaves, not only men, but also women, not only the young, but also the old, not only those of sound body, but also the maimed and those with mutilated limbs. All of you, he says, come. For such are the Master's gifts. He knows no distinction of slave and free, nor of rich and poor, but all such inequalities cast aside. Come, he says, all you who labor and are burdened. Thus a new standard of ethical behavior had been set. Whether in the wake of the Christianization of Europe, this did indeed lead to the formation of a more humane society would be the subject of another paper. Thank you very much. And I leave you with the other mosaic, the other baptistry in Ravenna, and you can see here again, it's a very similar baptism scene of Christ, of course.